Hello everyone, in this lecture we will cover the introduction to anatomy. Our fascinating journey through the human body will begin with an overview of the meanings of anatomy and physiology, followed by a discussion of the organization of the human body and the properties that it shares with all living things. Next, we will discover how the body regulates its own internal environment. This unceasing process called homeostasis is a major theme in every chapter of this book. Finally, we will be introduced to basic vocabulary that will help us speak about the body in a way that is understood by scientists and healthcare professionals alike. Anatomy versus physiology. What is anatomy and what is physiology? Two branches of science, anatomy and physiology, they provide the foundation for understanding the body's parts and functions. Anatomy, which means the process of cutting, is the science of body structures and the relationships among them. It was first studied by dissection, which is the act of cutting, the careful cutting apart of body structures to study their relationships. So today, a variety of imaging techniques also contribute to the advancement of anatomical knowledge. So whereas anatomy deals with structures of the body, we have physiology. So physiology means, physio means nature, study of nature. So physiology is the science of body functions, how the body parts work. So here in this table 1.1, it describes several branches of anatomy and physiology. So because structure and function are so closely related, we will learn about the human body by studying its anatomy and some of its physiology together. The structure of a part of the body often reflects its functions. This is very important in biology. We're going to see how always the structure determines the function. For example, the bones of the skull join tightly to form a rigid case that protects the brain, right? So the bones of the fingers are more loosely joined to allow a variety of movements. Or the walls of the air sacs in the lungs are very thin, permitting rapid movement of inhaled oxygen in the blood. Levels of structural organization. The levels of organization of a language would be letters that make up words, group of words make sentences, many sentences make paragraphs, and so on. This can be compared to the levels of organization of the human body. Our exploration of the human body will extend from atoms and molecules all the way to the whole person, from the smallest to the largest. 6 levels of organization will help us understand the anatomy and physiology, which is the chemical, cellular, tissue, organ system, and organismal levels of organization. So first, we have the chemical level. So here, this is the first one, is the chemical level. So the chemical level can be compared to the letters of the alphabet. The smallest unit is called atoms. And then as you know, everything around us is made up of atoms, and atom is the smallest unit, right? And multiple atoms together are called molecules. For example, here, as we can see in this figure, multiple atoms together are combined and they make the molecule DNA. So an example of an atom is a carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, and so on. The second level of organization is the cellular level. So cellular level are molecules that combine to form cells, which is the basic structural and functional unit of the cell. So a cell is the smallest living unit in the body. Examples of cells, we have muscle cells, nerve cells, epithelial cells, etc. So this figure here, it shows a smooth muscle cell, which is one of the 3 types of muscle cells in the body, which we will learn about it later in the upcoming chapters. So here, this is a figure of a muscle cell. Next, we have the tissue level. So number 3 is the tissue level. So those are a group of cells and the materials surrounding them that work together to perform a particular function. So there are only 4 types of tissues in your body. We have epithelial tissues, connective tissues, muscular and nervous tissue. Here, the one in this figure, since it is made up of smooth muscle cells, so here we can see a smooth muscle tissue, right, which consists of tightly packed smooth muscle cells. Okay? So next we have the 4th level, which is the organ level. Okay, so as you can see here, several tissues, they come together to form an organ. So similar to the relationship between sentences and paragraphs, organs are structures that are composed of 2 or more different types of tissues. They have specific functions and usually have recognizable shapes. So examples of organs are the stomach, skin, bones, your heart, liver, lungs, and brain. So here in this figure, we can see how several tissues, okay, the several smooth muscle tissues, they make up the stomach, okay? And then we have the 5th one, the 5th level, which is the system level. A system consists of related organs with a common function. For example, the digestive system's main goal is to digest food. So different organs like esophagus, stomach, small intestine, large intestine, pancreas work together to achieve a common function. And finally, we have the 6th level, which is the organismal level. So all parts of the human body, they function together to make up the total organism. Systems of the human body. In the chapters that follow, we will study the anatomy and the physiology of the body systems. So this figure and the coming slides in this table, it lists the components and introduces the functions of these systems. So we will also discover that all body systems influence one another. So as we study each of the body systems in more detail, we will discover how they work together to maintain health, provide protection from disease, and allow for reproduction of the human species. Okay, so we have 11 systems in the human body. So the 11 systems of the human body are the integumentary system, skeletal system, muscular system, nervous system, endocrine system, cardiovascular system. We have the lymphatic system and immunity, respiratory system, digestive system, urinary system, and the reproductive system. Okay, so here we can see in this figure the integumentary system and the skeletal system. Okay, so here the integumentary system, which we're gonna cover in chapter 5. So here it's showing us the components of the integumentary system. So the components are the skin and associated structures such as hair, fingernails and toenails, sweat glands and oil glands. The function of the integumentary system is to protect the body. It helps regulate body temperature, eliminate some wastes, helps make vitamin D, detect sensations such as touch, pain, warmth, and cold, and stores fat and provides insulation. Here we have the skeletal system. So the components of the skeletal system are the bones and the joints of the body and their associated cartilages. So what is the function of the skeletal system? It supports and protects the body. It provides surface area for muscle attachments. It aids body movements, houses cells that produce body cells, stores mineral and lipids such as fats. Here we have the muscular system. So the components of the muscular system is specifically skeletal muscle tissue. Muscle usually attached to the bones, right? Other muscle tissues include smooth and cardiac muscle. So the function of the muscular system is to participate in body movements such as walking, maintaining your posture, and it also produces heat. We also have the nervous system. The components of the nervous system are brain, spinal cord, nerves, and special sense organs such as eyes and ears. The function of the nervous system is to generate action potentials, those are nerve impulses, to regulate body activities. It detects changes in body's internal and external environments, interprets changes, and responds by causing muscular contractions or glandular secretions. Here we have the endocrine system. So the components of the endocrine system are hormone-producing glands such as the pineal gland, the hypothalamus, pituitary gland, thymus, thyroid gland, parathyroid glands, adrenal glands, pancreas, ovaries, and testes, and hormone-producing cells in several other organs. The function of the endocrine system is to regulate body activities by releasing hormones, which are chemical messengers transported in blood from endocrine gland or tissue to target organ. Here we also have the cardiovascular system. So the components of the cardiovascular system is the blood, the heart, and the blood vessels. The function of the cardiovascular system is the heart pumps blood through blood vessels. The blood carries oxygen and nutrients to cells and carbon dioxide and wastes away from cells and helps regulate acid-base balance, temperature, and water content of body fluids. Blood components help defend against disease and repair damaged blood vessels. So here we have the lymphatic system and immunity. The components are lymphatic fluid and vessels, spleen, thymus, lymph nodes, and tonsils, and cells that carry out immune responses such as the B cells, T cells, and others. The function of the lymphatic system and immunity is that it returns proteins and fluid to blood, carries lipids from gastrointestinal tract to blood, contains sites of maturation and proliferation of B cells and T cells that protect against disease-causing microbes. Here on the right, we have the respiratory system. The components of the respiratory system are the lungs and air passageways such as the pharynx, which is the throat, the larynx, which is the voice box, trachea, which is the windpipe, and bronchial tubes leading into and out of lungs. The functions of the respiratory system are it transfers oxygen from inhaled air to blood and carbon dioxide from blood to exhaled air. It helps regulate acid-base balance of body fluids, and air flowing out of lungs through vocal cords produces sounds. Here we have the digestive system. So the components of the digestive system are organs of the GI tract, the gastrointestinal tract, which is a long tube that includes the mouth, the pharynx, which is the throat, the esophagus, which is the food tube, the stomach, small and large intestines, and anus. Also includes accessory organs that assist in digestive processes such as salivary glands, the liver, gallbladder, and pancreas. The function of the digestive system is that it achieves physical and chemical breakdown of food, absorbs nutrients, and eliminates solid wastes. Here on the right, we have the urinary system, which is the components of the urinary system are the kidneys, the ureters, urinary bladder, and urethra. The functions of the urinary system is that it produces, stores, and eliminates urine. It eliminates waste and regulates volume and chemical composition of blood. It helps maintain the acid-base balance of body fluids, maintains body's mineral balance, helps regulate production of red blood cells. Next, we have the reproductive system. Okay, so here in this figure, we can see both the organs of the male and the female reproductive organs. So the components of the reproductive system are the gonads, which is the testes in males, and the ovaries in females, and associated organs such as the uterine tubes or the fallopian tubes, uterus, vagina, and mammary glands in females. As for males, we have the epididymis, we have the ductus deferens or the vas deferens, seminal vesicles, prostate, and the penis. The function of the reproductive system is the gonads produce gametes, sperm or oocytes, for sperm for males, oocytes for females, that unite to form a new organism. Gonads also release hormones that regulate reproduction and other body processes. Associated organs, they transport and store gametes. Mammary glands produce milk. Now we're going to talk about homeostasis. Homeostasis is the condition of equilibrium or balance in the body's internal environment. And homeostasis in the human body is continually being disturbed. Some disruptions, they come from external environment in the form of physical insults, such as the intense heat of a hot summer day or a lack of enough oxygen from that 2-mile run. There's other disruptions that originate in the internal environment, such as blood glucose level that falls too low when you skip a breakfast. And then we also have homeostatic imbalances which occur due to psychological stresses in our social environment, for example, the demands of work or school. And in most cases, the disruption of homeostasis is mild and it's temporary, and the responses of body cells quickly restore balance in the internal environment. However, there are some cases the disruption of homeostasis may be intense and it may be prolonged, like whenever you have poisoning or overexposure to temperature extremes, severe infection, or major surgery. So fortunately, our body has many regulating systems that can usually bring the internal environment back into balance. So most often we have the nervous system and the endocrine system. They work together or sometimes independently, and they provide the needed corrective measures so our body can go back to homeostasis. So the nervous system, it regulates homeostasis by sending electrical signals, we call those nerve impulses or action potentials, to organs that can counteract changes from the balanced state. We also have the endocrine system. It includes many glands that secrete messenger molecules called hormones into the blood. So nerve impulses, compared to the hormones, they cause very rapid changes, whereas hormones, they usually work more slowly. But both means of regulation, however, work toward the same end, usually through negative feedback systems. So what is a feedback system? The body can regulate its internal environment through many feedback systems. So a feedback system or a feedback loop, as you can see here in the figure in the right, is an example of a feedback loop, okay, or a feedback system, okay, is a cycle of events in which the status of a body condition is monitored, is evaluated, changed, or remonitored, reevaluated, and so on. So each monitored variable, such as body temperature or our blood pressure or blood glucose level, is termed as the controlled condition, okay? So this would be the controlled condition or the controlled variable. So any disruption that changes a controlled condition is called what is called the stimulus. Okay, so the stimulus, it disrupts homeostasis by increasing or decreasing a controlled condition. So a feedback system, it includes 3 basic components. We have the receptor, we have a control center, and we have the effector. Okay, so here this is the receptor, control center, and then we have the effectors. So a receptor, okay, so we're going to talk about the receptor, is a body structure that monitors changes in a controlled condition and sends input to the control center. Okay, here we have the control center. So this pathway is called an afferent pathway with an A. Okay, it means that it's carried toward, since the information it flows towards the controlled center. Okay, the input is gonna flow towards the controlled center. So typically the input in the form of it's gonna be in the form of nerve impulses or chemical signals. For example, certain nerve endings in the skin, they sense temperature and can detect changes such as dramatic drop in temperature. Next, we're going to talk about the second one, which is the control center. Okay, so the control center in the body, for example, is the brain, right? It sets the narrow range or set point within which a controlled condition should be maintained. It evaluates the input it receives from the receptors and generates output commands when they are needed. So output from the control center. So this is the output. It comes from the control center. Okay, typically occurs as a nerve impulse or hormones or other chemical signals. So this pathway is called an efferent pathway. With an E, it means away from, since the information flows away from the control center, right, to the effector. So in our skin temperature example, the brain, it acts as the control center, right? It's receiving nerve impulses from the skin receptors and generating nerve impulses as output. So the third one, we have the effectors, okay, effector. So is a body structure that receives output, just like we said, okay? It evaluates reproduction and other body processes. But or set point within which a controlled condition should be maintained. It evaluates the input it receives from the receptors and generates output commands when they are needed. So output from the control center. So this is the output. It comes from the control center. Okay, typically occurs as a nerve impulse or hormones or other chemical signals. So this pathway is called an efferent pathway. With an E, it means away from, since the information flows away from the control center, right, to the effector. So in our skin temperature example, the brain, it acts as the control center, right? It's receiving nerve impulses from the skin receptors and generating nerve impulses as output. So the third one, we have the effectors, okay, effector. So is a body structure that receives output, just like we said, okay, from the control center, and it produces a response, okay, and then or effect that changes the controlled condition. So nearly every organ or tissue in the body can behave as an effector. So when your body temperature, it drops sharply, your brain, which is your control center, it sends nerve impulses, which is the output, to your skeletal muscles, which is your effectors, right? So the result would be shivering, which generates heat, and it raises your body temperature. Okay, so a group of receptors and effectors communicating with their control center forms a feedback system that can regulate a controlled condition in the body's internal environment. In a feedback system, the response of the system feeds back information to change the controlled condition in some way, either negating it, that would be a negative feedback, or enhancing it, which would be a positive feedback. Okay, so now let's look at two general regulatory processes, which are the negative and the positive feedback. First, we're gonna talk about the negative feedback. A negative feedback system, it reverses a change in a controlled condition. So consider the regulation of blood pressure. So blood pressure is the force exerted by blood as it presses against the walls of your blood vessels, right? So when the heart beats faster or harder, the blood pressure is going to increase. So if some internal or external stimulus causes the blood pressure to rise, okay, in this case, the blood pressure is going to be the controlled condition, okay, the blood pressure. The following sequence of events is going to occur, and then let's follow that feedback loop here on this figure. Okay, so here this is the stimulus, and then it's telling us that the homeostasis has been disrupted because the blood pressure has increased. Okay, so first, and then remember we have the receptors, we have the control center, and then we have the effectors, right? So the receptors in this case are the baroreceptors, are pressure-sensitive nerve cells. They're located in the walls of certain blood vessels, and then their job is to detect whenever there's higher pressure. So the baroreceptors, they're gonna send nerve impulses, okay, which is the input, right, to the brain, okay, which is the control center, okay, and then which is going to interpret the impulses and respond back by sending nerve impulses, okay, so the output is going to be in the form of nerve impulses, okay, to the heart and the blood vessels, which in this case is the effectors, okay. So here in this case the effectors are the heart and the blood vessels. So heart rate decreases, and so that's the response, okay, and the blood vessels dilate, which means widen, and then that causes the blood pressure to decrease and then goes back to homeostasis, right, which is going to be the response. Okay, so this sequence of events quickly returns the controlled condition, blood pressure to normal, and homeostasis is restored. Okay, so notice that the activity of the effector causes the blood pressure to drop, a result that negates the original stimulus, which was an increase in the blood pressure. Okay, so this is why it is called a negative feedback system. Okay, so now let's practice, okay, this problem and see if we understood the feedback system, and then more specifically the negative feedback system. Okay, so here I'm gonna read a scenario and then we're gonna identify the receptor, the control center, and the effector in this problem. Okay, so the body maintains a relatively constant internal temperature to optimize chemical processes. Neural impulses from heat-sensitive thermoreceptors in the body, they signal the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus is located in the brain, and then it compares the body temperature to set a point value. When body temperature drops, the hypothalamus initiates several physiological responses to increase heat production and conserve heat. And then the responses are narrowing of surface blood vessels, which is vasoconstriction, which decreases the flow of heat to the skin. Shivering commences, which increases the production of heat by the muscles. And finally, adrenal glands secrete stimulatory hormones such as norepinephrine and epinephrine to increase metabolic rates and hence heat production. Okay, so here let's identify the receptor, the control center, and the effector in this scenario. So as you can see, okay, so the receptor is going to be the thermoreceptors, right, that send the input in the form of neural impulses, right, to the control center. So in this scenario, the control center is the hypothalamus, right, which is going to initiate physiological response, which is the output to the effector. And then in this case, the effector is going to be the blood vessels. And then the response is going to be to increase the heat production and conserve heat by narrowing of blood vessels, right, to decrease the flow of the heat to the heart. And then shivering, which increases the production of heat, and secretion of epinephrine and norepinephrine to increase the metabolic rate and produces heat. Now we're going to talk about the positive feedback. So unlike a negative feedback system, a positive feedback system tends to strengthen or reinforces a change in controlled condition. Okay, so here in a positive feedback system, the response affects the controlled condition differently than in a negative feedback system. So here the control center, it still provides comments to the effector, okay, and then in this case the control center is going to be the brain. Okay, but this time the effector produces a physiological response that adds to or reinforces the initial change in the control condition. Okay, so the action of positive feedback system, it continues until it is interrupted by some mechanism. For example, a normal childbirth, it provides a good example of a positive feedback system. Okay, so let's follow along in this figure on the right. Okay, so the first contraction of labor, okay, which is gonna be the stimulus, okay, in this case. Okay, so the first contraction of labor, it push part of the fetus into the cervix, which is the lowest part of the uterus, which opens into the vagina. So stretch sensitive nerve cells, which are the receptors. Okay, so here again we have the controlled condition, which is going to be the stretching of the cervix because of this stimulus, right? And then we have the receptor, we have the control center, which is the brain, and then the third one we have the effectors, okay? And finally the response. So let's start with the receptors. So the stretch sensitive nerve cells, the receptors, they monitor the amount of stretching of the cervix, which is the controlled condition. So as stretching increases, they start sending more nerve impulses, more input to the brain, right, which is the control center, which in turn it's gonna cause the pituitary gland to release the hormone oxytocin into the blood. Okay, so the release of the hormone oxytocin is gonna be the output that goes towards the effector. Oxytocin is a hormone that causes muscles in the wall of the uterus, which is the effector. So in this case, the uterus is gonna be the effector, right, to contract even more forcefully. The contractions push the fetus farther down the uterus, which stretches the cervix even more. The cycle of stretching, hormone release, and ever stronger contraction is interrupted only by the birth of the baby, right? So here this is the response. Baby's body stretches the cervix more. So this feedback is only gonna stop as soon as the baby is born, right? So then stretching of the cervix ceases and oxytocin is no longer released because it's no longer needed, right? So this is an example of a positive feedback. Okay, now we're gonna do another practice scenario, and then again, we're gonna identify the receptor, the control center, and the effector. Okay, so it's gonna be about milk production. Okay, so infant suckling triggers sensors in the areola, which send a nerve impulse to the brain. Okay, so the mammary alveoli are the site of milk production and storage in the mammary gland. So then the brain releases the hormone oxytocin from the hypothalamus and anterior pituitary. Oxytocin triggers myoepithelial cells in alveoli of the mammary glands to squeeze milk into the lactiferous duct. The more the baby suckles, the more milk is released and the more milk the body will produce. Okay, so now in this scenario, let's identify what is the receptor, the control center, and the effector. So here the receptor is going to be the suckling, right? The suckling triggers the sensors in the areoli. Okay, so the process of suckling is going to be the receptor, and then it's going to send nerve impulses to the control center, and then the control center in this scenario is going to be the brain, right? And then the brain is going to interpret this input and send out an output to the effector, and then which is going to be release of hormone oxytocin from the hypothalamus and pituitary gland, right? And then the response in this case is going to be the production and release of milk. Okay, so this is a positive feedback response. Homeostatic imbalances. Stressors are everywhere, and how well our bodies can maintain homeostasis or cope with these stressors determine if we are healthy or not. So as a simple example, temperatures drop at night significantly. If your feedback loop gets impaired, where the receptors on your skin don't sense the cold temperature, the blood will begin to cool down and multiple chemical reactions will stop in the body since there won't be adequate temperature regulation and your body will stop and you will die, right? So when homeostasis is disrupted, disease, disorder, and even death may result. Okay, so there's many factors that can contribute with homeostatic imbalances, including the environment, the individual's behavior, and then genetic makeup and nutrition, exercise, and many lifestyle choices. Basic anatomical terminology. So to communicate accurately about the human body, anatomists, they use specific terms. As health professionals, we need to speak this language in order to accurately communicate about our patients. Okay, so those basic anatomical terminologies are body positions, regional names, directional terms, planes and sections, and body cavities. First, we're gonna talk about body positions. Anatomical position is a standardized method of observing or imaging the body that allows precise and consistent anatomical reference. So the anatomical position is, whenever we talk about anatomical position, so in that case, our model or the human body or the person would stand erect, just like this figure, okay? And then facing the observer, and then the upper extremities are placed at the sides, okay? As we can see here in the figure, the upper extremities are at the sides. The palms of the hands are turned forward and the feet are flat on the floor, okay? Regional names. Regional names are names given to specific regions of the body for reference. There are a lot of them, but the effort to learn them will make studying the body systems way easier. For example, where is your brachial artery? Well, if you know brachia means arm, then this is an easy one, right? So the brachial artery is going to be the major blood vessel of the upper arm because it has the word brachia in it, right? Brachial artery. Regional names. The human body is divided into several major regions that can be identified externally. Okay, this slide is very important. The principal regions of the human body are the head or the cephalic region, the neck or the cervical region, the trunk, and the upper limbs and the lower limbs. So the head is going to consist of the skull and the face. So the skull, we call it cranial, and then the face, we call it the facial. So the skull encloses and protects the brain. The face is the front portion of the head that includes the eyes, the nose, okay, all those parts, no, until here, okay. And then we have the, so the eyes, the nose, the mouth, the forehead, the cheeks, and the chin, all right. And then we have the neck, which supports the head, right? The cervical region and attaches it to the trunk, okay? So this is the neck part, and then it divides between the cephalic region and the trunk, okay? The trunk, it consists of the chest, the thoracic region, right? The chest, and then the abdomen and the pelvis. Each upper limb, it attaches to the trunk, right, and consists of the shoulders. So here, those on the sides, we have the upper limbs, right, and then it starts at the shoulder. So the shoulder is what separates the the trunk from the upper limbs, okay, and then the same here on this side, okay. So we have an anterior view and a posterior view. Anterior means the front, posterior means the back, okay. So here, as we said, the upper limb attaches to the trunk, and it consists of the shoulder, the armpit, arm, which is portion of the limb from the shoulder to the elbow, the forearm, which is portion of the limb from the elbow to the wrist, and we have the wrist, and then we have the hand, okay. Each lower limb also attaches to the trunk and consists of the buttock, the thigh, which is portion of the limb from the buttock to the knee, okay, and then and then we have the leg, portion of the limb from the knee to the ankle, and then we have the ankle, and then we have the foot. The groin, okay, just like the shoulder, the way the shoulder separates the trunk from the upper body, here in this case we have the groin, okay. Groin is this part, and then so the groin, inguinal groin, yes, is the area on the front surface of the body marked by a crease on each side where the trunk attaches to the thighs. So this figure shows the anatomical and common names of major parts of the body. For example, if you receive a tetanus shot in your gluteal region, okay, the injection is gonna be in your buttock, right? Your buttock is gonna be your gluteal region. Because the anatomical term for a body part usually is based on Greek or Latin word, it may look different from the common name for the same part or area. For example, the Latin word axilla is the anatomical term for armpit, okay? So thus the axillary nerve is one of the nerves passing within the armpit, okay? So here, for example, axillary means armpit, brachial means arm, antecubital means the front of the elbow, right? We have the antebrachial, which is the forearm. We have the carpal, which is the wrist, palmar or vocal, which is the palm. Fingers are going to be digital or phalanges. Another word for thigh is femoral. The knee is going to be, the anterior surface of the knee is going to be patellar. The leg is crural. And then the pedal is going to be foot. We have the tarsal, which is the ankle. Digital or phalanges, again, we also call it digital or phalanges for the toe. Here, the top of the foot is called, and then the great toe is called a helix, okay. And then the same here we have, so the hand is called manual, and then the thumb is called pollex, okay. So the pollex is for the thumb, and then helix is for the great toe. And then when we look at the posterior view here, so the cephalic region, which is going to be the head. So here we have the base of the skull, which is called occipital. Later on, when we learn about the bones, we're going to learn occipital bone. It's going to be the bone that covers the base of the skull. The shoulder blades are called scapular. Okay, and then this is the back region is going to be the dorsal region. And then here, this region is going to be the lumbar region or loin. So here, this is where we have our spinal cord, spinal column, which is called vertebral. We have the back of our elbow. It's called cubital. And then here we have, so here this is where we have our sacral bones, okay, between the hips. And then this is the gluteal, which is the buttock. And then here we have the perineal, which is the region of anus and external genitals. We have the back of the knees, is called the popliteal region. And then the calves are called sural. And then the sole is called plantar. And then finally, the heel is called calcaneal. So here, this is a really cool video. And then if you go back to your slides and click on the link and go ahead and watch it, it will give you hints on how you can remember the regional terms. Now we're going to talk about directional terms. To locate various body structures, anatomists use specific directional terms, words that describe the position of one body part relative to another. Several directional terms are grouped in pairs that have opposite meanings, such as anterior, which means front, and posterior, which means the back. So here this figure shows the anterior position of the human body. So anterior, the word anterior or ventral is going to be the front, and then posterior or dorsal, it's going to be the back. Or if we're talking about an organ which is nearer to or is located at the back of the body, we refer to it as dorsal, right? Posterior, dorsal. And then if we're talking about an organ which is nearer to or at the front of the body, we call it anterior. Okay? Another directional term is going to be the right and the left. Okay, so the only thing about the right and the left is, as you can see here in this figure, our right is not the patient's right and our left is not the patient's left, right? Because we are facing the anterior view of this model of the human body, right? So your right is going to be the model's left, right? And then your left is going to be the model's right side. Another directional term is gonna be lateral and medial. Okay, so here lateral means further from the midline, okay, like on the sides, and then medial means nearer to the midline. Okay, so if this is the midline, okay, so if an organ is closer to the midline, to the middle of the body, we're gonna refer to is as medial. Okay, that's how the directional term is gonna be. And then if it's on the sides, either on the right or the left of the midline, we're gonna call it lateral, right? Which means farther from the midline. Okay, so intermediate means between two structures. Okay, let's do some examples. For example, the ulna, okay, is gonna be, so here this is your ulna. The ulna, this is the ulna, and then this is the radius, okay, the bones. So the ulna is gonna be medial to the radius because, as you can see, the ulna is closer to the midline of the human body, right? As for the lungs, so here we have the right lung, and then on this side we have the left lung. Okay, the lungs are gonna be lateral to the heart because the heart is found almost in the middle, more to the more lateral, okay, of the human body, okay, more to the little bit to the left side. Okay, however, the lungs, okay, on both sides are gonna be lateral to the heart. And then the transverse colon, okay, so here if you look at the large intestine, we have the ascending colon, we have the transverse colon, and then we have the descending colon. Okay, and then as you can see, the transverse colon is going to be intermediate to the ascending and the descending colon. It means that it's found between the two structures. So another directional term is going to be superior and inferior. Okay, so superior and then inferior. So superior means towards the head or upper part of the body. So anything like that is more close to the head or the upper part of the body, like it's located on top of another organ, right? Towards the upper part is gonna be called superior. And then we have inferior means towards the feet or towards the lower part of the structure. Okay, so here let's look at some examples. For example, the heart. Okay, so here this is the heart. Okay, and then the liver is gonna be here. Okay, it's gonna be, this is the liver. Okay, so the heart is gonna be superior to the liver, right? Because the heart is more closer to the upper body, to the head, whereas the liver is found as lower level than the heart, right? Or another example is the stomach. So here we have the stomach, okay? And then here we have the left and the right lungs, okay? Those are the lungs. And then as you can see, the stomach is gonna be inferior to the lungs, right? Because the lungs are here and then the stomach is down here. So another directional term is going to be proximal and distal. Okay, so this is proximal and then this is distal. Okay, so proximal is going to be, so this is mostly related to your limbs. Okay, for example, here your upper limbs. Okay, so whenever we say proximal, it means that nearer to the attachment of a limb to a trunk. So here, as we said, the shoulders are what separate the upper limbs and the trunk, right? So here, proximal is going to be, so the nearer, okay, to the attachment, to this attachment, okay, the nearer to this attachment is going to be called proximal. And then distal, remember the word distance, distal, okay, it means further away from the limb to a trunk, okay? So it's gonna be further away from this attachment point, okay? So this is only used for structure on the same limb, okay? Like I cannot use this structure when I'm talking about, let's say, the humerus here and then the ulna on this side, okay? It has to be on the same limb. So let's look at some examples. For example, here the humerus, okay, this is the bone, the humerus, okay, this is the humerus, and then and this is the radius, okay. So the humerus are proximal to the radius, right, because it's located closer to that point of attachment, okay. Or the phalanges, remember the phalanges are the fingers, right? So the phalanges and then the carpals are gonna be here, okay? I don't know if you guys have heard people who have carpal tunnel, okay? They're around their wrist hurts, so that would be the carpals, okay? So the phalanges are distal to the carpals, right? Because the phalanges are more further away from the attachment points, okay? Another directional term is going to be superficial and deep. Okay, so superficial means toward or on the surface of the body, and then deep is going to be away from the surface of the body. So whatever we can see, it's like it shows on the anterior side or even on the posterior side, the things that are sticking out. Okay, those are going to be the superficial surface of the body, right? And then the deep means that they're away from the surface of the body. It means that they're deep in the body, okay? So let's do some examples. For example, the ribs, okay? So here we have the ribs, okay? They are superficial to the lungs, okay? So this is the left lung, this is the right lung, and then as you can see, the lungs are inside the ribs. They're protected by the ribs. It means that the ribs are superficial and then the lungs are deep inside the ribs, right? So the ribs are deep to the skin of the chest and the back. The ribs are superficial to the lungs. Now we're gonna talk about planes and sections. Planes are imaginary flat surfaces that are used to divide the body. Okay, so we're gonna talk about the different planes. We have the frontal plane, we have the mid-sagittal plane, parasagittal plane, transverse plane, and oblique plane. Okay, so first we're gonna talk about the frontal plane. Okay, so this would be the frontal plane. So frontal plane basically is, it divides the body in anterior and posterior. Okay, so whenever you have a frontal plane, it means that you're dividing the body between the front and the back. Okay, so that's gonna be the frontal plane. Next, we have the sagittal plane. The sagittal plane, it divides the body into left and right. Okay, so for example, here we have the mid-sagittal plane. Okay, so this line here, mid-sagittal, it means that it's dividing the body into left and right. Okay, here this is another term, it's called perisagittal plane. Perisagittal means that it's more lateral. It means that it's more on the side, for like it's not exactly in the middle. Okay, but you are still dividing the body into left and right. Okay, so that one is going to be called perisagittal plane, and then the one through the midline is going to be a mid-sagittal plane. So another plane is going to be the transverse plane. So the transverse plane is this plane here, and then this plane here is the plane where you are dividing the body into superior and inferior, right? It means that you're dividing the body in half, and then you have the upper part or the lower parts, okay? So in other words, a cross-sectional or a horizontal section. So finally, the last one is going to be the oblique plane. Okay, oblique means that it passes through the body at an oblique angle. Okay, so just like this figure here, okay, you can see how it has an oblique cut. Okay, so this is called an oblique plane. So here we have examples of planes and sections. So some structure are easy to see in one section but not in others. Okay, so here we have a brain, okay, and then we're looking at the different planes of the brain. Okay, for example, here we have a mid-sagittal plane, a mid-sagittal section, and then remember we said mid-sagittal is like from the middle, and then you're dividing the brain into the left and the right, exactly from the middle. Okay, and then next we have the frontal plane. Okay, so we said the frontal one is going to be the one where you're dividing the brain between the front and the back. Okay, so here we can see an example of a frontal section of the brain. And then here we have a transverse section. Okay, and then for the transverse section, remember we said that it can be divided between like superior and inferior, the upper part and the lower part of the brain. Okay, and then this would be the transverse section. Now we're going to talk about body cavities. Body cavities are spaces that enclose internal organs. Bones, muscles, ligaments, and other structures separate the various body cavities from one another. We will discuss the several body cavities here in this figure. So we have the cranial cavity, which is in yellow, okay? And then we have the thoracic cavity, which is in blue. And then finally, we have the abdominopelvic cavity, okay, which is made up of the abdominal cavity and the pelvic cavity. And then we can see it here in green. First, we're going to talk about the dorsal body cavity, okay, which is in yellow. The dorsal body cavity, it can be broken down into the cranial cavity and the vertebral canal. Okay, so it's going to be this whole yellow section, cranial cavity and the vertebral canal. Okay, we have a lateral view, it means sideways, and then here we have an anterior view, it means the front. Okay, so the cranial bones form a hollow space of the head called the cranial cavity, which contains the brain. And then we have the bones of the vertebral column, the backbone. They form the vertebral canal, which is the spinal, okay, canal, which contains the spinal cord. The cranial cavity and the vertebral canal are continuous with one another. And then 3 layers of protective tissue, the meninges and a shock-absorbing fluid surround the brain and the spinal cord. As for the ventral body cavity, okay, we can see it in blue and green. The ventral cavity, it can be broken into the thoracic cavity, which is going to be the blue part, and then also the abdominopelvic cavity, which is the green. The major body cavities of the trunk are the thoracic and the abdominopelvic cavities. The thoracic cavity, okay, so this is the thoracic cavity. It's going to be this blue here. Okay, so the thoracic cavity or chest cavity is formed by the ribs, the muscles of the chest, the sternum. The sternum is going to be the breastbone, and the thoracic portion of the vertebral column. And we also have the diaphragm, which is a dome-shaped muscle that separates the thoracic cavity from the abdominal pelvic cavity. Okay, so this is going to be the diaphragm here, this layer here. So here in this figure, we're again, it's showing us the lateral view. It means sideways, and then here we looked at it as the anterior view. Okay, so in the next slide, we're going to talk about the abdominopelvic cavity, which is going to be the green region. So the abdominopelvic cavity can be broken down into abdominal cavity and the pelvic cavity, okay? So here, this is the abdominopelvic cavity, this whole green portion. However, it's divided into abdominal cavity and pelvic cavity. So here, this is the line where it divides between the abdominal cavity and the pelvic cavity. Okay, so here this is a right lateral view sideways, and then this is an anterior view where the model is facing us. So the abdominal cavity is going to contain the stomach, the spleen, gallbladder, and most of the large intestine, whereas the pelvic cavity is going to contain the urinary bladder, portions of the large intestine, and internal reproductive structures. Membranes. A membrane is a thin, pliable tissue that covers, lines, partitions, or connects structures. One example is a slippery double-layered membrane associated with body cavities that does not open directly to the exterior, called a serous membrane. It covers the viscera within the thoracic and abdominal cavities and also lines the walls of the thorax and the abdomen. The parts of the serous membrane are the parietal layer and the visceral layer, which we're gonna see in the next slide. There's a figure showing us these layers. So the parietal layer is the thin epithelium that lines the walls of the cavities, and which is technically the outer layer. And then the visceral layer is going to be a thin epithelium that covers and adheres to the viscera within the cavities. So between the two layers is a potential space that contains a small amount of lubricating fluid. Is called the serous fluid. So the fluid allows the viscera to slide somewhat during movements, such as when the lungs inflate and deflate during breathing. Okay, so let's pretend that if we have, like, for example, this is the heart, let's say, and then we have the walls, the layers protecting the heart. Okay, so the layer that is gonna touch the organ, the heart, is gonna be called the visceral layer. Okay, visceral layer. And then the outside layer, because we said it's a double layer, right? And then the outside layer is going to be called the parietal layer. And then the fluid inside the parietal and the visceral layer is going to be called the serous fluid. Okay? Thoracic cavity serous membranes. So the pericardium and pleura membranes cover the heart and lungs respectively. So here in this figure, we have an anterior view of the thoracic cavity. Okay, so here we have the pericardium. Okay, it's a membrane that covers the heart, And then here we have a pleura, which is also a membrane or a double layer membrane that covers the lungs, okay? So here, the serous membrane of the pleural cavities is called the pleura, okay, for the lungs. The visceral pleura, okay, so the visceral pleura is gonna be the inside layer, okay? The visceral pleura clings to the surface of the lungs, and the parietal pleura, which is going to be the outside layer, okay, lines the chest wall, covering the superior face of the diaphragm. So in between is the pleural cavity, okay, so this is the pleural cavity. It's found between the parietal pleura and the visceral pleura. Okay, is filled with a small amount of lubricating serous fluid. So the serous membrane of the pericardial cavity is the pericardium. Okay, so now the heart. We have the visceral pericardium, which covers the surface of the heart. Okay, so here the inside layer is going to be the visceral layer, which covers the surface of the heart, visceral pericardium. And then we have the peritoneal pericardium, which lines the chest wall. Okay, so here this outside layer is going to be the parietal layer, which lines the chest wall, and then between them is the pericardial cavity filled with a small amount of lubricating serous fluid. Abdominal cavity serous membrane. So the peritoneum is the serous membrane, but it's for the abdominal cavity. So we have the visceral peritoneum, okay, is gonna be the layer that covers the abdominal viscera, right, the inside lining. So it's gonna be the ones in those blue lines, okay, and then we have the parietal peritoneum, okay, which lines the abdominal wall covering the inferior surface of the diaphragm, okay, which is gonna be this red line all around the abdominal pelvic cavity. Okay, so visceral peritoneum, it covers the organ. The parietal peritoneum lines the abdominal wall. So between them is the peritoneal cavity. Okay, so this yellow portion inside is the that area, the whole area inside in yellow is going to be the peritoneal cavity, which contains a small amount of lubricating serous fluid. Most abdominal organs are surrounded by the peritoneum. Some are not surrounded by the peritoneum. Instead, they are posterior to it. Such organs, we call them retroperitoneal. Okay, retro means behind, such as the kidneys, adrenal glands, pancreas, duodenum of the small intestine, ascending and descending columns of the large intestine, and portions of the abdominal aorta and inferior vena cava are all organs that are considered retroperitoneal. Finally, we're going to talk about the abdominal pelvic regions and quadrants. Okay, so the abdominal pelvic cavity can be divided into 9 regions to easily describe the locations, the location of the organs. Okay, so the names of the 9 abdominal pelvic regions are going to be the right hypochondriac region. Okay, so this side is going to be the right hypochondriac region. Here we have the left hypochondriac region. This here we have the epigastric region. Here in the middle, we have the umbilical region. This side is going to be the right lumbar region. Here we have the left lumbar region. Here we have the hypogastric region. And then here we have the right inguinal region. And on the left, we have the left inguinal region. Okay, so this is an anterior view showing location of the abdominal pelvic regions. And then here, those were the 9 regions. And then we use those those names of those 9 regions so that we can describe the location of an organ. Okay, we have also divided the body into quadrants. So here we have an anterior view showing location of abdominopelvic quadrants. So we have 4 abdominopelvic quadrants. We have, so here, this is gonna be the right upper quadrant, and then this is gonna be the left upper quadrant. Here we have the right lower quadrant, and then here we have the left lower quadrants. So the 9 region division is more widely used for anatomical studies, and quadrants are more commonly used by clinicians for describing the site of abdominopelvic pain, a tumor, or another abnormality. Okay, so this is the end of this chapter. Please let me know if you have any questions. Thank you.